There are a few figures in American history more familiar, more distant than George Washington. His face is everywhere, on currency, monuments, paintings, and in the collective memory of the nation itself. He's often portrayed as something larger than life, a marble figure standing above the messy realities of history. But behind the mythology was a very real man, ambitious, disciplined, cautious, and deeply conflicted, and carrying the immense burden of creating a nation that had never existed before. Washington didn't simply win a war, he helped invent the presidency, establish civilian control of the military, and create precedents that would define the American Republic long after he left office. At multiple moments during the fragile early years of the US, the survival of the experiment seemed to rest almost entirely on whether Americans trusted George Washington enough to hold it together. Yet his story is also filled with contradiction. He was both revolutionary and an aristocrat, a champion of Republican ideals who was also one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia. He famously surrendered power when he could have held on to it, helping set a democratic precedent that reshaped world history. And perhaps more than any other founder, Washington understood that the success of the United States depended not just on victory, but also on legitimacy, restraint, and unity. That story is explored in a sweeping new biography, American Patriarch: The Life of George Washington, from Pulitzer Prize finalist and best-selling historian H.W. Brands. The book traces Washington's rise from young Virginia surveyor and soldier to commander of the Continental Army, constitutional statesman, and America's indispensable founding figure, while also examining the human being behind the icon. Joining me today is H.W. Brands himself, one of America's foremost narrative historians and the acclaimed author of works on figures ranging from Benjamin Franklin to Ronald Reagan and Andrew Jackson. A quick word from our sponsors. Well, Bill, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be with you, Peter.
So, you have tackled biographies of some of these largest figures in American history. Why was Washington the right fit at this time?
Because I had avoided doing him
I love that.
consciously for a long time. I I knew, of course, I knew about Washington. I'm a teacher. I teach the Revolutionary era, the 18th century, and so I knew all about Washington. But from the distance of just seeing him against the background of everybody else, I could not figure him out. I could not get a handle on him. He was not one who made himself accessible to people easily, in the way that, say, Benjamin Franklin did. Now, Benjamin Franklin's a tricky character too, because he was presenting himself as he wanted the world to see him. But Washington, he was always there. I wrote about Washington, but I wrote around Washington as much as I wrote about him directly. And finally, I was talking to my publisher, this now about 3 years ago, on what should I do for my next project, and we observed that the 250th anniversary of American independence was coming up, and I had written sort of about Washington obliquely, but had never taken him on directly. And I had written several biographies in the past, but my the last several books before this were not biographies exactly. They were sometimes sort of dual biographies. They were telling a story from two sides or sometimes three sides to get more of an ensemble cast rather than a single main character. My publisher thought, Bill, your biographies have done pretty well, and this 250th anniversary, how about George Washington? And I said, well, sure, okay, that sounds fine. And I was really intrigued as I took on the project because, well, I will say one thing, that those of us in the history world, especially who deal with the era of the founding of the Republic, have to give immense thanks to the people at the National Archives, and especially to David Ferrier, who's the archivist, who put together the online version of all the papers of the founders, and it's Founders Online, and it's fantastic. And so everything that Washington ever put a pen to that survives to the present is available at the touch of a computer screen and your keyboard. And so there he is, and I got a chance to really dig into the guy and try to figure him out.
Interesting. When we last spoke, a couple of years ago, you said there are some characters that you eventually they tire you out. You're with them for so long. How did you feel? How does he fit into, your Avengers assembly, assemble kind of thing you got going here.
So since you put it in that format, and this is the way I sort of expressed to you, yeah, there are some characters that you write about in biographies who just live forever and tire you out that way. And then there are other characters who are just they are so tiresome to be around, not because they're boring necessarily. In fact, the one that comes to my mind is Theodore Roosevelt, who was just the opposite. He was never boring, but he was always absolutely full of himself. And and I don't like to say this, and I hope it doesn't come across in my books, but there's some of my characters I know I wouldn't have liked him in real life, and I wouldn't have liked Theodore Roosevelt. Now I think I did him justice, and it's kind of immaterial, I think anyway, if the biographer likes the subject or not. But with Washington, Theodore Roosevelt had a relatively short life. He lived to 60 years old and he died of a heart attack suddenly. And I'd sometimes say about Red, but he's one of my longest books because he was a busy guy. He had lots to write about and he was a very writable character. But I sometimes say that if he hadn't died at that relatively early age, I would have had to kill him off because he was wearing me out. On the other hand, Benjamin Franklin lived a ripe old age of 84. But he was a congenial guest to have around. You write a biography, you basically have a guest in your house for as long as the project lasts. And I'm not ashamed to admit that when I wrote the paragraph describing Franklin's death, I shed a tear. It was this really engaging figure. And I felt that I was a fuller, better person for having spent that time around Benjamin Franklin. George Washington is sort of in the middle in that he lived longer than Franklin Roosevelt, shorter than Benjamin Franklin. He did have a full life, but there's one of the things about George Washington that's different from both of those other two characters, and it makes it sort of difficult for the biographer in that he reveals very little of his soul in his letters. He kept a diary, but the diary was really just what I did today, not what I was thinking today. He he's somewhat candid in letters to his one of his brothers and to a few close friends, although he didn't really have people that he would have considered buddies. He was not a buddyable guy, but he was he had big jobs. He had two really big jobs in his life. He commanded the Continental Army for 8 years, and he was president of the United States for 8 years. So for those two things alone, but he also had he was someone who tended to his character and tended to the impression that he gave to the world. And so he was careful around himself. He didn't intrude, he didn't impose on people. And in that regard, when he died, my story with him finishes, the timing was just about right. He had done everything that I guess he was destined to do, although I hesitate to say anybody's destined to do anything. But his it was clear that from the standpoint of American history, his work was over. And it was it was better that he went suddenly as he did than he had lived another 15 years in declining health. In fact, his health was declining. And he died of what would have been just an innocuous infection had he lived in the age of antibiotics. He died
Yeah.
very suddenly. He was just stricken, and within 24 hours, he was dead.
And even the way textbooks, teaching about him for years, it's always like he does what he had to do, he steps down, and it almost goes right to the next sentence. And then he dies, in bed next to
Yeah,
Mark.
yeah.
Right. There's not that big gap afterwards. You're right. He did what he was supposed to do, and then he moved to the side kind of thing.
And from the standpoint of making a good story in history, that exiting, at your high point or near your high point is really important. I, I'm a student of the presidency, among other things. And the two greatest presidents, aside from Washington, it's Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. And Washington dies a couple of years after he leaves the White House. But Franklin Roosevelt dies in the White House, and Lincoln's assassinated in the White House. And so, at their moment, particularly in the case of Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, at the moment of victory in the great war that they're leading the country through, it's clear victory is there, and boom, they die. And so they don't have this aftermath. You don't have to deal with what happens later. And in both cases, for Lincoln especially, if he had lived long enough to deal with Reconstruction, his reputation would not be what it is, simply because Reconstruction was a whole lot harder than the Civil War in terms of the politics of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. I always, when I throw that in, that big exit at the right opportune time, I always throw Polk in there as well. Like I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna do all these things, and then boom. It's like
Well,
you're right. He
Polk
just
is
leaves it.
it's very interesting because Polk was one of the basically the only presidents who said ahead of time, "This is what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to leave." And there are presidents who sometimes decide at the end of a first term they're not going to run again, but usually they sort of waited to see how things were going. But he said ahead of time, "These are the four things I want to do." Boom, 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 boom. He did them and he left. And he said, "And if I get them done, I'm going to leave." And and then he died not long after he left the White House. And you can't deal with these what might have beens, but if he had been elected a second term, he would have died in office. So it's almost as though he saw his own demise coming and decided to step off the stage while he was still in full faculties.
Amazing. So your book is, I found it very captivating as well because when usually we study about Washington, it's always, the marble, man, the pantheon of American history. But, you mentioned a lot of his setbacks, failures, right? Even humiliations. And how do you feel like those in particular shape his leadership style and really who he becomes as a national figure?
Anybody studying or writing about Washington has to answer a couple of important questions. Number one is, how did this guy who was as well set in Virginia, as in Virginia, a British colony, you know, within the British Empire, how did this guy become the leader of the rebel forces? What made this guy a rebel? Rebels are people who are not successful with the things as they are, who want to make these huge changes. How did Washington come about this? What was going on there? And in that case, I mean, some of it is that Washington was frustrated by the ceiling he felt that the British Empire and I'll call them British folkways, put on his advancement. At a relatively early age, Washington discovered that he was a talented young man, and he was especially good at war. He was a really good soldier and military commander. Some of it came from his first exposure to enemy fire in what would be the beginning of the French and Indian War. And he writes to his brother and he says, "I've heard the bullets whistle. Indeed, there's something charming in the sound." So he was one of those rare people, thankfully, that I think it's thankfully that they're rare, that are drawn to battle, that are drawn to the danger of it. And those are the people who become the great military figures. So, and then in the same French and Indian War, he sized himself up against British regular officers. These are people sent over from Britain, and usually they got their commissions, their military commands, because they had purchased. This is the way you got an office in the British Army. You paid for it, and you had to have money, and you had to have connections. You didn't necessarily have to have any talent. And Washington went to battle alongside some of these British officers, and he discovered he was much better than they were. And so, if the British Army had been a meritocracy, Washington would have been shifted from the Virginia militia and given a commission in the British Army, and he would have had a chance to advance in the British Army. And if indeed the British had been enlightened enough to do that, he might have become, you know, Cornwallis, General Cornwallis. I mean, the equivalent in the British Army. He might have become, if he lived long enough, Wellington. I mean, he was really good at military command. But the striking thing is, if the British had been that enlightened, then Washington would have been on their side, assuming there had been an American Revolution. So one of the things that I draw from this is the British deserved to lose the American Revolution. They deserved to lose the American colonies because they were so foolish and they were able to misgovern so badly that they could lose the support of somebody like Washington, who was predisposed to be in favor of the British Empire. So that's one question you got to ask about Washington. And another is, how did he know enough to be the first president of the United States? He hadn't been a politician. He had been in the Virginia House of Burgesses, but his other exposure to politics was as commander of the Continental Army. He had to deal with the governors of the various states and with the Continental Congress. And so he was dealing with the government from the outside, but he didn't have any political executive experience. Now, of course, he had plenty of executive experience as a commanding general. It may very well be that what the United States needed as its first president was a general, somebody who could make decisions. That's not actually the case, but it didn't hurt. And so Washington becomes this brilliantly successful person without having the external characteristics that one thinks of as brilliant, brilliant success. He wasn't the smartest guy in the room. He wasn't as smart as Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't ambitious in any obvious way. I mean, again, Hamilton, he was a climber. He was going to get everything he could. Um, One of the conclusions that I made about Washington was that if there ever was a good argument for aristocracy, Washington was it, where you take these people who are, I mean, he was one of the reasons he could do what he did. He served in the Continental Army, he commanded the Continental Army for 8 years without taking a salary. He could afford to. He could go into politics. He could become president of the United States, knowing that he didn't have to make up for lost income during the Revolutionary War. So he could, it was, what shall I say, easier for Washington to do the right thing than it would have been for somebody like Alexander Hamilton, who had to consider other things. How am I going to get ahead? How am I going to make a living? How am I going to support my family? All this stuff. And the conclusion that I draw from all this is that Washington was in this paradoxical position of having, not by himself, of course, but created the American Republic. So more than any other single individual, Washington was responsible for this independent United States, this republic. And it was a system that basically made everybody equal before the eyes of the law. And it would take a while for that actually to work out. But so he helped create this republic. He created this modern country, but it was a country he could not have comfortably inhabited himself. He was a holdover from the days of aristocracy. And in fact, one of the conclusions I draw at the end of the book is that one of the reasons that Washington is held in such esteem as the first president was precisely because he was the first president, but he was also the last of his kind to be able to hold the office. For Washington, the presidency was a victory lap. It wasn't the culmination of his ambition. It was something that was handed to him. He had to be talked into it rather than something he had to strive for. In Washington's case, certainly at that time in his own mind, it didn't add anything to his resume to become president of the United States, because there had been presidents of the United States before. They were presidents of the Continental Congress. And nobody knew that the president of the United States was going to be that big a deal. In fact, Washington was the first president. And even then, it wasn't considered to be that big a deal. It wasn't really until the 20th century that the presidency was seen as this thing that really set you apart. This is the reason that in American history, most 19th century presidents are really unmemorable. The presidency is part of my business, and I still have to think carefully. Millard Fillmore, wait a minute, what did he do? Franklin Pierce, these. But when you get into the 20th century, now they're really big figures. And so Washington's historical reputation benefits from that ex post facto rise of the importance of the presidency.
Do you think, like other people of his time, or rather, maybe this is a to what extent question, he kind of cultivated that image because he always kept on saying the only thing he always wanted was to go back to Mount Vernon, right? That was always his thing. But how much of that maybe was a performance of this like Republican virtue versus him genuinely wanting to go back? Like he's aware of posterity.
The part of that going back to Mount Vernon really was sincere. He was never happier than when he was working on his farm, as he called it. He considered himself a farmer. I mean, he was a planter and a slaveholder, but he had a farm, and he was responsible for the farm. And reading his daily diary, he'd say, okay, we planted the oats this week, and we trimmed the pear trees, and we did this. This was what he really got engaged in. And so that part was very sincere. But at the same time, as you suggest, he did cultivate his persona. I'll put it slightly differently. He cultivated his reputation. For Washington, his reputation meant everything. And fortunately, the way he defined his reputation was to be a man of principle, a man of integrity, a man of upstanding devotion to his country. And so he wanted to be seen as this person who had all of these Republican virtues. And And he decided that the easiest way to be seen that way is to actually cultivate the virtues themselves. So he became this thing that he wanted to present himself to being. And this comes out when he's trying to decide whether to accept the presidency. He'd been the general. He was comfortable being a general. That was his comfort zone. He knew soldiers, he knew armies, he knew warfare. Politics, no, not really. And so when he gave up his military command at the end of the Revolutionary War, he had no temptation whatsoever to make himself a Julius Caesar and march on Philadelphia and take command of the country. He didn't want to do it. And I should add here, it was unclear what he would be taking command of, because the United States in 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, was an alliance. It wasn't a country. He would have been, if he wanted to seize political power, he might have marched to Williamsburg or Richmond to take control of Virginia rather than the United States. That would have been a bigger prize. But he didn't want to do that, in part because it conflicted with his concept of himself, but in part because that wasn't a particular prize. When Caesar took Rome, Rome was a big deal. The United States wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a particular prize to take. But when he is brought back into politics, James Madison talks him into attending the Continental Congress. I'm sorry, the Constitutional Convention, because he knows that having Washington on board will lend prestige to this project that Madison has put together to try to revise the Constitution. And Washington is there. He's a presiding officer, and so the Constitution goes out and it's ratified. And then we got to have a president. And once again, Madison and Hamilton joins at this time to say, we really need you to be the first president because your reputation, the dignity you have will help get this country out to a good start. But Washington is torn. He can't decide whether to do this or not. And he writes to some of his friends saying, I'm thinking about this. And my real question is, what is this going to mean for my reputation? And on the one hand, he's got this great reputation as the victor of the American Revolution. So, and he's moving from that prize and his comfort zone into politics, which he knows is going to be much more treacherous. And he thinks, if I take the presidency, my reputation is probably going to be tarnished because this is not something I'm particularly good at. And and I lower myself to the realm of all these other political types. And then he says, but if I don't take this, then will people take me seriously when I say I have the best interest of the nation at heart? Because, hey, your country called for you and you said no. What, you think you're better than the presidency, or you think that you've done enough and it should be left to other people? So he's thinking about this all in terms of his reputation, and he really isn't sure which is going to be. And I'm convinced that he's not just doing this for form's sake or for appearance's sake, because again, I studied the presidency, and I know that the presidency wasn't that big a deal at the beginning. And again, almost today, nobody knows that there were 5 people who were called president of the United States before Washington. And now, of course, this is a new constitution, but nobody had any idea that this constitution would last any longer than the Articles of Confederation. So who knew what he was getting into? So Washington is an interesting character, somebody who did cultivate the way the public viewed him. But in order to do that, he made himself into this figure, this person that people would indeed admire. And when I come down to it at the end, and I ask myself, so how did Washington accomplish what he accomplished? And I didn't want to conclude this because this is so trite, but it really was a triumph of character. And this is what Washington had. Other presidents, other public figures have other gifts, but he had this sterling character. Nobody breathed a word of scandal about Washington. Nobody ever accused him of taking money that he didn't have. Nobody accused him of double-crossing people. And this gave him a great ascendancy over other people. Now, some of it was exaggerated. It's not that he was the only moral character around at the time, but because that was the thing that he studied and that was the thing that he really put forward, people saw that in him. I'll add one last thing on this, and that is that you get into politics and you're surrounded by lawyers, and lawyers are not impressed by other lawyers, and lawyers are not impressed by people who are glib and articulate and who can talk. Washington understood the power of silence. And so he never spoke more than was absolutely necessary. So people thought he was much deeper than he actually was. So
That's awesome. I remember also studying the fact a few things there. One was the fact that he had a lot of French books in his library because it made him seem prestigious almost. It was like a level of when people showed up, like, wow, look at your library. But he couldn't read French, but it wasn't about that. It was like we would today have a nice car outside kind of thing.
there was that,
Um,
but the
right?
library wasn't simply for show. You're right. He didn't read French, but he did read a lot. And this because, strikingly, he had almost no formal education. I mean, he had tutors when he was young. He had an older brother who was sent off to England to be educated, but by the time it got to Washington, because he was the son of a second wife and things got more complicated. So he had to learn for himself when he was appointed to command the Continental Army. He had to get his hands on all the military history books, all the military manuals he could find, and read up on it. He's heading off to Boston to figure out what to do with his army.
Yeah, self-taught. So this is just to kind of a few questions to finish us up. But I guess my one question is, if we had a DeLorean, and you're thinking of like the almanac or whatever that Biff went back and got, but if George Washington was to get a copy of this book, what do you think he would quietly approve of, and what do you think he might maybe surprise him about this portrayal of his life? That's a tough question. I'm sorry.
Hope that Washington would think that I gave him a fair shake. That my approach to writing history, especially biographies, is to try to convey to the reader, after I figure out for myself, what was it like to be this person? Because I want to convey history by showing how it looked to the people who were there. In this case, Washington is my test case. And so I would hope that Washington thought I gave him a fair shake. If if Washington was surprised at anything, it would probably be the coverage I give to his opposite numbers, the British generals he was fighting against, the French generals he was fighting against. And I wouldn't say that he wouldn't necessarily be surprised that I'd given the coverage, but of course, while he was fighting against General Gage or while he was fighting against General Howe, he wasn't reading their correspondence. He never did read their correspondence. I read their correspondence, so I know what they were trying to do. So I give Washington's side of preparation for battle, for example, and then I give Howe's side of preparation for battle. And so my reader can see what's going through Howe's mind as much as he can see what's going through Washington's mind. So I think Washington actually might find that interesting because he would have had questions. So why did he do that? And why was he taken so surprised at the Battle of Trenton? And didn't Cornwallis see that he was going to be pinned at Yorktown? Why did he let that happen?
That's awesome. Yeah, imagine having the ability to see the your opponent's thoughts. That would be something for sure.
Boy, it's one of the things I've been thinking about. What would it be if your thoughts were transparent to me and transparent to everybody? It would be the scariest thing in the world.
Oh, we would. I think we would get headaches. I think I would sit down and cry at some point because it would just be too much for me to handle. So every research always has this aha moment. Sometimes you're lucky and you have a lot of aha moments. Can you think of a moment as you're doing this research, you're traveling, you're reading, where you kind of stop and you're like, all right, this is why I'm doing this. Like this makes it for me.
In the case of me and Washington, it really emerged early on in the story, in my telling the story, when he is off on a surveying mission in the backcountry of Virginia and then what's going to become Ohio. He's surveying this for Lord Fairfax, and he's with one of the Fairfax kids. And he really revels in this outdoor experience. He writes about how the weather is terrible. It's snow mixed with rain, and they're soaking wet. And the rivers are freezing, and they're falling in and doing all this stuff. But he really likes it. One of the things that I didn't sufficiently appreciate about Washington ahead of time, and this is something that served him really well during his command of the Continental Army, he just liked being outdoors. He liked being on horseback. We would say he liked camping and the backwoods life, and he really did. And a soldier in the army at war, that's a lot of what you do. And there are other officers who don't. So, General Howe and the British, they were holed up in Philadelphia while Washington's out at Valley Forge. And the Americans, they're exposed to the wind and the cold and everything, and the British are snug in the city. And that right there almost tells me why the Americans won. Because, if they can do this, if they can do this by a combination of the American frontier people, the colonists were more used to this kind of thing than the folks in Britain who lived in regular cities and that kind of thing. But also, it showed their determination. And and the American victory in the Revolutionary War was a triumph of will and conviction, as much as it was a triumph of arms. Washington understood from right at the beginning that he didn't have to win the war; he simply had to avoid losing the war. And eventually, the British would get tired and go home, which is exactly what happened. So it was. I learned more from the early period of Washington's life than I expected to.
So, Bill, my last question. If there was a class or a course at your university that was called Books That Matter, and every semester it was a rotation of three new books, and this would go on for years and semesters, and you got a chance, the dean came up to you and said, all right, Bill, you get to pick one book for this semester to our three-book rotation of Books That Matter, that these students will take this class on. What book do you think you would submit for students to read?
Well, first of all, I'm going to say that although I'm a teacher, I really am reluctant to say everybody ought to read this book. The effect of a book on a person is really as much a match of tastes and inclinations as it is the quality of the book itself. But if if I were in a position to say this, I'm going to suppose this is I'm a historian, so I'll think it for a history class. I would say that no, I'll put this, it's a backhanded compliment.
And
No
this is
one
also
will be no one will
yeah.
be disserved by reading or rereading the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, because Franklin is a seminal figure in American life and American culture. There is nobody who is more archetypally American than Franklin. And unlike Washington, Franklin is a figure whose model value, whose exemplar value carries forward. So it's as valuable to somebody in the 21st century to understand how Franklin viewed life and success and relations with other people as it was in the 18th century when he wrote it. So it's an autobiography that wears very well. I have to add here, I am very partial to primary documents in history, what the participants and the observers wrote at the time, rather than what historians write coming along later, and I include myself in this bunch. So, so I would choose a memoir or an autobiography in any case in answer to your question. So Franklin's is the one. Washington never wrote a memoir. He wasn't inclined to write. But even if he told us everything about his life and his approach, it it would be an example that would be of almost no use today because of what I was saying earlier. He was the last of the aristocrats, and he was the last person who could get away with that in American politics. But Franklin is more the everyman, even though he was a brilliant genius, and everybody was not like Benjamin Franklin. So it would be Franklin's autobiography.
I sometimes have heard the autobiography, or at least parts of it, expressed as a self-help book. An old school self-help book that would, like you said, is still relevant to the world today, which is
Yeah,
amazing.
there's no question about it. Yeah,
That's nuts. Well, Bill, tthank you so much. This was an amazing interview. I really appreciate you taking the time.
thanks for having me on, Peter.